What if the face people love most on you isn't the one you're wearing anymore? She catches it in the shop window before she means to, her own reflection, mid-laugh, phone still at her ear. The strange part wasn't the reflection, it was that nobody on the call had noticed a thing. He only calls when something's wrong, she knows this. She answers warm anyway. The call ends. She stays a second too long, staring at a face she didn't choose to make. Later at dinner, someone says it, meant as a compliment. You're exactly the same as always. It should feel good. It doesn't. It lands like being praised for never leaving a room she was never happy in. Sometimes love doesn't ask you to change, it asks you not to. A portrait sitting takes one afternoon, one pose, one slant of light. Somehow that's enough for people to stop looking. She was never sitting for a portrait, she didn't know anyone was painting, so who exactly has she been showing up as every day since? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from doing the same performance for people who stopped noticing it was one. Think about the last time someone said you seemed off. Not upset, not angry, just slightly delayed, slightly less warm than usual. Chances are it wasn't a bad day. It was a rare, unscripted moment. The mask slipped for 4 seconds, and someone clocked the gap between the face and whatever was actually underneath it. Most of the time, nobody notices. That's the part that should be unsettling and usually isn't. The version of a person that others fall for is rarely their most complicated self. It's the one shown early, before either of them knew what would be asked of it later. Best behavior kept running long after anyone asked it to. And once that image exists in someone else's mind, it becomes surprisingly durable. Not because it's accurate, because updating it costs them something. It's easier to keep loving the photograph than to sit through the discomfort of realizing the subject moved on without telling anyone. This is why "you've changed" almost never arrives as a neutral observation. There's usually something else underneath it, something closer to a complaint about access than a complaint about character. You used to be available in a way that made me comfortable, and now you're not. Something was lost. But is it a personality, or something closer to a service? Nobody seems to want to say it that plainly. There's a strange, quiet cruelty in this. The people closest to an old version of someone are often the most invested in that version never leaving. Not because they don't love the person, because the earlier draft is the one they know how to love without effort. So they keep visiting the frame instead of the room. And here's where it gets harder to sit with. How many people someone claims to know well are actually just a sitting they remember, hung carefully in an unchanging light, while the actual subject has quietly kept living somewhere the frame doesn't reach? The portrait was never dishonest. It captured something real, once, in a single afternoon of good light and a willing pose. What happens to it after that is a different question entirely. There's a version of this that's harder to talk about, because it isn't about what other people refuse to see. It's about what happens when someone keeps handing them the old portrait anyway. She still picks up. She still uses that voice. She still remembers the small details, still shows up looking like the person everyone expects to find. From the outside, nothing has changed. The performance is seamless, but somewhere behind it, she's not there anymore. Present in behavior, absent in participation. This is the part almost no one accounts for, that a person can keep sitting for the same portrait long after the sitting should have ended, and not even notice when it happened. Not out of dishonesty, but out of momentum, the kind that doesn't ask permission before it keeps going. And the strange thing is, the people around her aren't entirely wrong to miss the old version. Something real is gone, but what they're grieving usually isn't her. It's something else wearing her face. The version of her that used to make things easier for everyone, still clocking in. Nobody sends flowers for a service that quietly ended, though maybe that's exactly what everyone's grieving without knowing what to call it. So it keeps getting relabeled instead. Not, "she stopped being available in the way I needed," just she's different now, colder, distant. Here's the paradox underneath all of it. Growth is so often received as betrayal, for reasons that rarely have anything to do with the person doing the growing. Varnish doesn't hide anything. It was never meant to. It only exists because someone decided the sitting was finished, and something had to keep it looking that way. Step back from the portrait for a moment. Look at what it actually was before anyone decided to treat it as an ending. It was never meant to be the whole of someone. It was a single afternoon, one particular light, one pose held long enough to be captured, and that was it. Nobody sitting for a portrait believes that's the final version of their face. They believe it's a record of 1 hour on one day in one mood. Only later does someone else start treating it as the whole truth. But nothing about a person was ever finished. Not the day the portrait was painted, and not now. A sitting, a frame built around it, a coat of varnish applied to keep the frame convincing. And only now, after enough time, does anything from underneath start to show through. Not because it was hiding, but because varnish was never as permanent as it looked. There's a word for this, if it needs one at all. Restorers call it Pentimento, an earlier image quietly surfacing through an old canvas, faint lines the paint was never quite thick enough to erase. So maybe the dishonesty was never in the portrait itself. The portrait was accurate, once. What happens later is harder to name, and even harder to place the blame for. The insistence that one sitting should hold for a lifetime. The quiet agreement, made by everyone except the subject, that the picture on the wall might be close enough to the truth that no one needs to come back and look again. Some call this the persona. What it actually is depends on how long it's been since anyone checked underneath the varnish. There's no fixing this. That's the part worth sitting with before anything else. Nothing here is a problem to solve. Not for the person who changed, and not for the people still holding on to the earlier sitting. There's no clean conversation that updates a portrait someone has loved for years. So the discomfort of being misread by people who loved an earlier version might not mean what it's always assumed to mean. It might mean something closer to the opposite. Not proof of coldness or distance or betrayal, no matter how many times it gets called that. Maybe it's only proof that the frame was always smaller than what it was framing, though it took this long to notice which one was actually true. Cleaning doesn't repaint anything. It just undoes what the varnish was doing all along, which was never protecting the picture. It was protecting everyone's agreement about when the picture was supposed to be finished. She sees it again days later, her own reflection in a different window, on a different street, not on the phone with anyone, just walking. Just her face, doing whatever it does when nobody's on the other end of a call, asking it to perform something. She doesn't recognize it right away either. But this time, the not recognizing feels different. Less like a stranger caught wearing her expression, more like meeting someone mid-sitting, paint still wet, nothing sealed yet, nothing finished enough to hang anywhere. Somewhere across town, in a house she doesn't live in anymore, an old portrait is still hanging exactly where it's always hung, still being walked past, still being glanced at fondly by someone who hasn't stood in front of it and really looked in years. They'll tell people they know her well. They'll believe it too. And the room will stay exactly that quiet, for exactly as long as no one thinks to ask why the woman in the frame never seems to age. And why, lately, she never seems to be home.